So I'm just delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, the Reverend Stephen Minnema, or as many of you know him, Deborah Buffton's husband. Steve was a Presbyterian pastor for 45 years, and in his semi-retirement has served as an interim pastor for local Lutheran churches, as well as teaching courses in the religious studies and ethics programs at Viterbo Universities. He has been involved in circles of support for 20 years in Madison and La Crosse. And Steve has spoken to our fellowship several times and has been always well received. So please welcome Steve.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you. I'm going to move this over here. I know that all of you, or not all of you, but many of you know that as you get older, you can remember things 50 years ago, but not yesterday. And I'm thinking about that as I'm thinking about a memory from 52 years ago when I was a student in Boston, and I was walking in a neighborhood through the Back Bay. And I was amazed. I came across a brownstone building with a sign out front that said, "The Unitarian Society for the Appreciation of Jesus." I'm not making this up. It was true. Well, if there is such a society, this parable that we just read, it seems to me, is one way that we can appreciate Jesus. You don't have to take it literally to understand the power of what he's saying here. Jesus would create a society in which true greatness is measured not by who you can put down, but by who you can lift up, right? But as I pondered this parable this past week, I was struck by how important seeing is. Lord, when did we see you hungry, sick, naked, or especially today, in prison? When did we see you in prison? That's what I'd like us to ponder today. But before we talk about that, I want to give you an illustration of the importance of seeing that came across to all of us just recently. You heard about the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't you? To the group in Japan representing the survivors of the nuclear bombs we dropped there back in 1945. You read about that, right? They were awarded the Peace Prize for their persistent efforts to warn humanity against the use of nuclear weapons. But if you read further, what was interesting is that as they reported their experience since their organizing back in the early 1950s, what they said repeatedly was that in those early years, people didn't want to see us. Japanese didn't want to see them because they were reminders of the shame of their defeat. The Allies didn't want to see them because they were reminders of what we'd done. But now, all these years later, we're finally waking up to the fact that seeing them offers us perhaps our last best chance of saving ourselves from ourselves. You follow me? I want to propose today that something similar is true of our seeing the imprisoned, truly seeing them, and seeing what they say about ourselves. What do you see when you see the imprisoned population in the United States? First thing you see is that we imprison people in our society, we incarcerate people at approximately double the rate of other democracies around the world. Yes, and in Wisconsin as well. Another thing you see as you look at the prison population is that people of color are disproportionately represented, showing our racism and the racism of our justice society, of our justice system. Another thing you see is that approximately, by best estimates, 40% of the prison population is mentally ill. And another thing you see is that a great many others in the prison population are suffering from addiction, and we've decided to punish them instead of treat them. So what do you see when you look at the prison population? Right, you see a lot of people that need to be lifted up. But if you keep your eyes open, you look at us as a society, and what does this say about us other than that we are prepared to discard people because we don't want to put any resources into helping lift them up? And the other thing that you see when you see this clearly is that if we continue living this way, pushing aside those who can't conform to our standard of living, to the way we live, if we continue in this way, our society will continue to disintegrate. So I'm suggesting that just as with the survivors of the nuclear holocaust, seeing the imprisoned population gives us a chance to save ourselves from ourselves. And to make a new community, to make a new commitment to being community with our neighbors. Now, I'm here before you because for 20 years I've been trying to do this kind of seeing in small groups known as circles of support, where we gather community people, 4 or 5 of them, and surround formerly incarcerated people and try to see what kind of seeing can happen as we, the circle members, see the core member, and the core member sees us. And we begin to see ourselves in a new light. And the core members begin to see themselves differently as well. It's all about seeing. And as I've thought about that in preparation for this talk today, I realized there were 4 things I wanted to tell you about my experience of circles and of trying to create this kind of seeing among us. The first thing is, it's not easy. There's all sorts of obstacles to true seeing in a circle like that. For instance, I've known people who have joined the circles to be a supported person of a core member, but they couldn't really open themselves up to seeing fully. All they saw was somebody who'd made a mistake, somebody who needed to just get his act together and turn it around. Why can't you do what's reasonable? That kind of person wasn't willing to see into the trauma of the core members' past, the pain, the hopelessness, the despair. Wasn't willing to see, wasn't willing to look. But then it's also difficult, very difficult for a core member, male or female, to allow herself or himself to be seen. There's so often shame in people's past. There's so much pain in people's past. To expose themselves to a small group, to see them, is not an easy thing. I've known many people who've come into circles to be part of the circle who have fled quickly when they realized that they were going to be seen more than they'd ever been seen before. It's not easy. Nor is it even easy for many core members to be seen positively, all their potential, all their gifts, all the possibilities for them. That's scary too. So the first thing about this experience is it's not easy to create a community in which people are really seeing each other. Not easy. But the second point I want to make is that you know you're making progress when conversations start to get honest. I mean, really, gut level honest, you're making progress. I want to mix my metaphors a bit. In my ministry for many years, I had a clown character, and I led worship services as a clown. Once a year, I'd get my costume on and I'd lead a service. And I remember one year, my clown had brought with him to the service a little bell. And he went out into the congregation asking people different questions. And sometimes they would dodge, and sometimes they'd answer truthfully. And whenever they would answer truthfully, my clown character would ring the bell so that people would hear the ring of truth. And I tell you that in those circles, I'll never forget the many moments when the ring of truth could be heard, because people were seeing each other. And the third point I want to make about this is that when this kind of seeing happens in a small group, healing begins, real healing. Because people who had been ashamed of what they'd done or who they were able to expose themselves to others and be accepted. People who felt guilt for what they'd done were able to confess, acknowledge that, the mistake they'd made, and begin to glimpse the possibility of forgiveness. And people, and this is a big one, people in those circles who'd never really felt that there was a place they belonged could begin to sense, maybe there's a place I can belong. So that kind of healing happens as seeing happens. But then the last thing I want to share with you about this experience is that probably the greatest sign that a circle has been successful in promoting this kind of seeing, the greatest sign of all, is that mutual accountability is created. We care about each other enough to let ourselves be accountable to each other. And when that happens, I can guarantee you that recidivism goes down. So let me tell you a story about this, one of my great memories of ministry. In Madison, we circled up a man, 60-year-old African-American man who'd been in prison for cocaine possession and sale. During his years in prison, he got religion, and it was a true conversion. He was a musician, so he started singing gospel tunes to his fellow prisoners. And when he got out, he was still subject to that temptation of that addiction, so we circled him up, a group of men, we circled him up for a year. And we supported him as he struggled to come back into the community and to turn his life around. He had so many gifts. He was a musician, he was a chef, and we supported him, and finally we graduated him from the circle and hired him as our assistant custodian at the church. And so he would come in and clean the church on the weekends. But occasionally we'd also say, would you play for us in church? And he did. And then occasionally we'd say, we're having a meal, would you create the meal for us? And he would. And watching him, seeing him come around the church was one of the great images to me of what a beloved community looks like. And then one day, it was a weekend. Eddie was due to come in to the church to clean. I was walking out the door, and he was coming in, and I could see how troubled he was. He was just trembling. And he came over to me, and there were tears streaming down his face, and he hugged me. And I said, Eddie, what's going on? He said, yesterday, somebody offered me some cocaine, and I took it, and I used it. And I'm so sorry. And so I hugged him. And I said, thanks. Thanks for sharing this. Thanks for knowing that when you fell back, the first thing you needed to do was to find someone to confess that to and to support you in doing better the next time. Because we had developed accountability with each other. It's not easy, but that's the remedy for recidivism, isn't it? We're working with a circle member, a core member right now that some of you met him when he was here a few weeks ago. And we've been trying to support him. And so one of the things that we did was to say, what you need is just a few affirmations that you can say to yourself, repeat to yourself, when you're feeling hopeless, when you're feeling lost. And so I wrote down a few affirmations, and I put them on this purple piece of cardboard and gave them to him. And actually, the other members of the circle took them too. And I said, say these to yourself every morning. And this is what it is. I am loved more than I know. I am forgiven more than I feel. There is more music in me than I can hear. There is more hope for me than I can see. All this because I am not alone. Because I've been seen. Thank you.